La da 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 da. La 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 da da. Good morning. I am just working on getting everything set up and getting all of the things sent out. Trying to double check and see if we are actually getting out today. It might not actually be getting out today, which might be a problem. We kind of had this discussion last night as I was checking out of the live, and I wanted to make sure that I had it again because it's one of those things that is a focal point and that I'm trying to make sure gets out there on a broad scale anyways. And so you can hear my cat whining for me in the background. I want to make sure that it's one of those things that I take the chance and opportunity to talk about on a regular basis. And see if it's not usually one of those things that has a lot of interest. Well, it does have interest, but not a lot of interest all the time. So I want to make sure that I still get to it and still get some information out of it, right? So I spent the morning updating my website so that everything is a little bit more easy to look for and find on there with all the bibliography thought processes on there. And I think that I had tried to publish some pages with some information on them, but they hadn't published with information on them before, so I kind of changed up that a little bit as well. So the account has been on private for the last couple of days, and I'm not sure if we're having issues due to the account being on private with exposure. But I'm kind of having to keep it on private for a while, and we'll see whether or not I have to turn it back to private after this live, because pretty much anytime I go live, I come back with the need to take my account private. So we'll see whether or not I have to change it up when I get back off. But I did want to go ahead and touch on some of the European ancestry that we know of, and some of the DNA that we're finding and some of the finds that we find in Eurasia, as trying to help people find their connection with their European ancestry. It's part of the reason that I came into TikTok. It was part of what I was asked to do by family, to try and help Europeans, and to try and help allies and accomplices reconnect with that appropriating culture. And so because there's this movement within allies and accomplices for many different groups that I'm a part of, most people who are actually trying to help and trying to actually be a part of the movement forward are trying to do so in a positive way. Yet it's really hard for many people in the diaspora within America to find their European ancestry and to do it in a positive way, and to do it in a way that doesn't cause problems for themselves or for others, and to do it in a way that isn't cultural appropriation of other people's culture. And so that's one of those goals that I've been really putting forward. This is for anybody with European ancestry. It doesn't matter, what social group that you fit into right now. This is anybody who's looking to find that connection with the ancestors that they have in Europe, to try and find a deeper ability to sing with their ancestors, like we talk about in here a lot. If you are new in here, if you are not usually in my lives, I want to go over a couple of things at the start of my live. I am an archaeologist, a paleoanthropologist, a historian, a storyteller. I have spent a lifetime in study of these things and have degrees in these things. I also do medicine. I've been a healer most of my life. I am also an activist, and I'm a war vet. I do not believe that I should have had to pay 40 grand for my college degrees. And I don't believe that anybody else should have to pay an exorbitant amount for information that should be easily accessed and broad knowledge, right? And so, because of that, I use this platform to try and express that information for people on a broad scale knowledge. Uh, Education should be free. It shouldn't be gate kept. It shouldn't be gate kept behind big words that most people don't understand. No, Huckleberry. I don't know what that one. So, and I also am not an authority, not trying to be an authority. I am not an expert. These are my focus points, and I am trying to give a basic level understanding. I have a website that compiles articles that you can easily access. So they're not like always scientific journal articles, just because those are not always easily accessed without paying for them. Um, and you can go through and you can get the information from them and take that information and take it further. Like you can go in and find the information on HLD6, the new skull that we found in Asia that's very similar to early Homo sapiens. And you can find HLD6 as the name of it. And then you can go and Google HLD6 and you can dig deeper and find your own information, because I firmly believe I am live. I firmly believe that we learn better when we are engaged in what we're learning, when we're doing our own work, when we're doing our own research, when we're really trying to interact with it. I firmly believe that we learn better. I dropped out in the 8th grade. Couldn't handle the shit that they were doing. Like, it was just stupid. I knew half of it, didn't want to understand the other half of it. Had teachers stay and work on this, and I stayed and I worked on this. I ended up with a GED later on. Once I got into college level courses, once I got into a place where I could choose what I was learning, my mind went, ooh, more. Give me more, because I'd always been that person. I've been reading archaeology and history texts since I learned to read in archaeology and history texts. And so I believe that when we are questing for that knowledge, we get more of that knowledge. We retain it better and we want more of it and we learn better. And so I'm giving you a base for you to go out and go, oh, that exists. Let me find more information on it so that you can learn it and feel it and understand it, right? Um, and so with that, I use TikTok for that basic stuff. I do writing as well. I publish books, trying to publish more, and I'm trying to get out more information. But I use TikTok as a base platform to get it out to as many possible people as I can on a free level. In my platform, are in my live space, TikTok gives everybody that has 1,000 followers a live space. This is my space. TikTok gave it to me. I get to set the boundaries and the rules of this space. My space, I ask for the kindness that I'm giving to be returned. I am not here to be shitty, hateful, rude, mean. I am here to teach you how much you are worthy and valuable and how loved you are, because curiosity is an amazing thing, right? And knowledge is an amazing thing, and you yourself are an amazing thing, right? So I am here in kindness and love, and I ask that it is returned, right? And then I also teach a lot of how we debunked the theory of race, why the idea of race is so nasty through society, how it is othering, that is something that's roughly 10,000 years old, that is not who we are as a species, and how all of these things are methods of control. All of these things are to keep you under somebody's thumb and to keep you under somebody's check. So in my space, I ask that you do not bring your racism in, and you do not bring any phobias based on gender or desire or religion. Take them somewhere else. I also want nothing to do with your God. I don't like him. So that is who I am and what I'm doing and what today is about. Today, specifically, we're going to be speaking about the ancestors of Europeans. We're going to talk about how the ancestors of Europeans move into European space. And we're going to talk specifically about some of the different cultural things that we can see with European ancestry. This takes it back to like 30,000, 40,000 years. And so it's not necessarily your Celtic or your Germanic culture. And where you connect with your indigenous ancestors of a space is going to depend on how you connect. So it's going to be one of those different things within it. Why do I have a man who does not look European behind me on the screen? I have what is a Gravachian person behind me on the screen. The Gravachians we know of through the culture of their art. We see several different instances of our very first depictions of humans within the Gravachians and our anamorphic pictures or depictions within the Gravachians. One of those things that we see very early on is roughly 40,000 years ago. So would be at the start of the time period of the Gravachians. And it came across the news recently within last year. And it is a lion-headed figure of a man that has like markings on his arm, right? The other thing that many people really know when we talk about the Gravachians are the goddess statues and goddess figurines that we have at the Gravachians. And this is the goddess of Willendorf, right? And the goddess of Brasamthi, the goddess of Brasamthi. These goddesses are goddesses that we're finding in the European area, that we're finding the Gravachians in, which for the most part is the lower half of the western part of Eurasia. And we see those goddesses like everywhere, right? The headdress that we see on this man is a headdress that is taken from those depictions of the goddesses. We also see that the Gravachians are some of our earliest cave art outside of Neanderthal within Europe. And we also see that our earliest tattooing implements that we have evidence of comes from the Gravachian period within France. So when we're looking at all of those things, we can see not only through the DNA, but through the things left behind, the belongings, the things that were important to them, the different levels of cultural connection for the Gravachian period. Now, first thing that I want to talk about with how they're getting there is where from and how. There's a lot of conversation that goes on about how out of Africa has been debunked. The concept that we all originate in Africa as a species, Homo sapien, has never been debunked. What has been debunked is the concept that at 150,000 years ago, the Europeans left Africa and they started evolving further than those who remained within Africa. And why this concept has been debunked is because we know that there are several migrations outside of Africa of Homo sapiens and several migrations back in Africa of Homo sapiens. We also know that one of those main things that we think of as the out of Africa thought process is European or Homo sapiens moving into the Levant area in the Arabian Peninsula area where Neanderthals were already moving down because of the last ice ages at 150,000 years ago and living in that area. And as they're living in that area for roughly 100,000 years, they're moving up and they're moving down. They're going with Neanderthals back when the ice is receding, and they're coming back into Africa with the genetics of the Neanderthals and the children that they have. So Homo sapiens and Neanderthal are living in a couple of caves 5 minutes walk from each other in the Levant area for roughly 100,000 years until 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years ago, the ancestors of all the populations outside of Africa today, with the exception of the indigenous Australians, seems to have made its final movement outside the Levant area. And this is through our DNA lines, is why we state this. Because when we're tracing back the mitochondrial DNA or we're tracing back the Y DNA, we can find a founder of your mitochondrial DNA or a founder of your Y DNA, what we call a mitochondrial Eve or a Y atom. And when we trace back the mitochondrial DNA or the Y DNA in that tracing back, we can decide when somebody left a period or when or place and when somebody got to a place. And so when we're looking at who everybody is, or the descendants of the people outside of Africa currently today, what we're looking at is a foundation Eve and a foundation Adam, and that foundation leaving and going out. Now, again, I want to reiterate the fact that we see that indigenous Australians are there at 70,000 years ago, and that we see that Turtle Island indigenous people, their DNA puts them having separated and arrived or gotten fully separated DNA-wise by 54,000 years ago from the rest of the population outside of Africa, right? We have populations in Africa that date back DNA-wise, I think it's 120,000 years. And the populations that we see within Africa that date back DNA-wise are also populations that hold the full of the whole human genome, the full of the Homo sapien genome within them. So these are populations that we consider to be the foundation populations of Homo sapien. And that population is the Kwe people of South Africa. You might know them as the Khoisan. That is not an appropriate word to use. Kwe is better if you can't make that clicking sound with the tip of your tongue against your roof. I can't. I can roll my R's, but not that, or maybe San. But Kwe is, to my understanding, preferable. So the populations who are moving out of the Levant area into Western Eurasia are moving out of the Levant area into Western Eurasia around 50,000 years ago. And as they're moving out of the Levant area into Western Eurasia around 50,000 years ago, what we're seeing globally is that the ice is going up like this. It's receding. As the ice is receding, the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula start to become distinct from Africa. Prior to this, because of the levels of ice and the lower sea levels, the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula are actually attached to Africa. Those seas are not there. So the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula becomes distinct from Africa at this time frame. And as the ice is receding, you see that lakes are getting deeper. You see that places that were uninhabitable for both species, Neanderthal and Homo sapien at the time, are now inhabitable. You're seeing that there are still Neanderthal populations in Western Eurasia that had stayed in those areas. So if you got a group of Neanderthals who are going down with the ice and they're staying in Spain, they're staying at the Iberian Peninsula, and in the Italian Peninsula, all along the lake bed, or not the lake bed, the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, along the upper edge of the Mediterranean Sea, at the same time that you saw those different group of Neanderthals going into the Levant area and going into the Arabian Peninsula area, right? So as Homo sapien is moving out of the Levant area and out of the Arabian Peninsula area on their final movement out, we're seeing that they're coming up and around with Neanderthal people with them. So they're a group mixed of them and Neanderthals as they're making that movement over and moving into territory that may or may not be occupied by Neanderthals, depending on where that territory is. This is a point that I want to get a definition for everybody of what migration, immigration, and colonization mean. Migration is moving into a space that is not already occupied by other groups of human, or it is having a migratory yearly pattern for your sustenance, right? The immigration is moving into a space that is already occupied by another group of humans, and you become a part of that culture that is already there. You become a part of that people that is already there. You don't change them with subtle ways might change, absolutely. Like you might be introducing a new food, but you don't tell them what culture they're supposed to have, and your culture doesn't take over their culture. Their governance and everything else stays the same, and you meld into that. Colonization, almost always done through violence, is moving into a space where there is already a people and imposing your culture and imposing your government on a culture that already has culture and government. So these are three different terms for movement of humanity. When we're looking at how early Europeans are moving into this area, they're moving into this area with Neanderthals in many cases. And when they're moving into areas that are occupied by Neanderthals, we see that they're not taking over Neanderthal thought processes. Now, they might be introducing their own thought processes to the Neanderthal thought processes. That's a really cool way that you made that spear point. You want to see how I made this spear point? Or I see that you are not like tightening your clothes around the edge, but if I show you how to tighten your clothes around the edge, it might keep the wind out for you, right? It's also important to note that many of the cultural practices that Homo sapiens have by now have been affected by their 100,000 years of coexistence with Neanderthals. So Neanderthal concepts are already deeply embedded in the Homo sapien concept. We see that burial and death and self-identity are in Neanderthals before they are in Homo sapiens. And it's almost like the mix of Neanderthal and Homo sapien creates these concepts within the two. So as we're moving within the European area, we are entering in some spaces again that already have Neanderthal within them, and we are entering as the ice moves up into spaces that do not have Neanderthal. Our understanding of Neanderthal is that they're gone by roughly 40,000 years ago. So any movement into any space after 40,000 years ago is moving into a space that is not occupied by Neanderthals anymore. Many people like to think that we killed off the Neanderthals. We did not kill off the Neanderthals. There's no evidence of violence between us and the Neanderthals. In fact, there is great evidence of cultural exchange and great evidence of genetic exchange. By the time we are meeting up with the Neanderthals, they've already gone through 2 extinction events, and they are extremely genetically narrow. Their Y DNA has long been replaced with our Y DNA. Their prior Y DNA was Denisovan DNA, and they are inbred. They are uncle marrying niece, cousins marrying cousins. And because of this, they see a new group of genetics and go, "Oh, yay, more genetics, yay. We're not going to be as mutated. We're not going to, my aunt's ugly anyways," right? Like we see that there's this new group of genetics and they go, "Let's get that." Because pretty much every species knows that inbreeding is not beneficial to the species as a whole. So when you are inbreeding, you start to see these things coming and you instinctually know what the fuck is going on. And we know that because of the fact that most species won't inbreed, right? Unless we've had a significant impact into their thought process, right? So, because of this, we're seeing that Neanderthals are welcoming in Homo sapiens, and Homo sapiens are welcoming in what looks to them just like another human being, because Homo sapiens' origin actually comes from a convergence of many different species. So, your mother might be Heidelbergensis, and your father might be Antecessor and look completely different, where your grandmother is Erectus. So, Homo sapiens don't have this concept that different is bad at this point of time. At this point of time, they have this concept that you don't look like me. That's kind of cool, right? And so, as they're moving into these spaces with Neanderthals and taking the Neanderthal thoughts that they've already gotten, maybe, or the ones that they're getting now, and they're introducing their thoughts to the Neanderthals, there is this convergence of thought. Now, by 40 to 30,000 years ago, we see that we have a people who has settled. The prior to the Cretaceous population, we call the Araraceans or the Proto-Araraceans. And this is a roughly 50 to 40,000 year period, or 10,000 year period, but 50 to 40,000 years before the Cretaceous culture. The Cretaceous culture is kind of our first real, like we sink into this as what the culture is. And again, this is also because we start to see within the Cretaceous culture that they are depicting representations of themselves, so we can start to see cultural thought process. The group of people that is moving in at this time is dark of skin. I know that there's 1,000 different ways you want to tell me differently, but the thing is there's nothing that tells us anything other than they're dark of skin. Everything shows us that people within Eurasia are actually dark of skin until roughly 10,000 years ago, for the most part. There might be the occasional group of people who has gotten lighter because they lived on the steppes, but even then at 10,000 years ago, we're still seeing darker skin. We actually see that lighter eyes come about before lighter skin comes about. And the reason that lighter eyes come about comes before the reason lighter eyes come about before lighter skin comes about is because lighter eyes are an adaptation for a low light environment and the ability to see predators. And so it is much more important for me to be able to visualize my environment and see what's going on around me than it is for me to receive vitamin D from the sun when I can get vitamin D from many other sources, because there are many sources of vitamin D outside of the sun. So when we see that Europeans are moving into Eurasia or Europe, when we see this movement around, until 10,000 years ago, what we are seeing is people that we would define as phenotypically Black. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that that is our definition, that race doesn't exist. We did touch on that, and I'll go on it a little bit more later, of course. And that our vision of a phenotype does not have anything to do with the genotype, does not have anything to do with who somebody is within them. Okay, so the color of your skin, race has been debunked. The color of your skin has nothing to do with how smart you are, how good at sports you are, whether or not you can handle pain, has nothing to do with that. So when we are looking at this group of people moving in, we are looking at a people who were the same group of people who was in Africa, the same group of people who was in the Levant. They share genetics and they share history. They share stories, they share understanding. For the most part, there is a world tree in almost every culture across the globe. Now, I have heard of like 3 different spaces that do not have a world tree in their culture. To me, this states that this is one of those oldest understandings of us. The tree provides for us. The tree provides a home for us. The tree provides food for us. The tree provides homes for other people, right? So actually, the only 2 places, and I do have the resources for that on my website. The only 2 places in Africa, the only 2 communities in Africa who do not have Neanderthal DNA within them are the Yoruba population and the Kwe population. And they have 3 ghost species within them. Every other group within Africa actually has 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, according and prior to colonization, so pre-colonization. According to studies done by archaeologists and ancient DNA studies. So those in Yoruba have three ghost species within them. Ghost species are species that kind of like, we see a little bit of Neanderthal in our DNA or a little bit of Denisovan. We see little strands of DNA and we're like, we're not sure where that came from, but we haven't found the whole population. We haven't found not the whole genome of the person. So we haven't found them in the fossil record and gotten DNA from them. And so we call them a ghost species. So we have three within the Yoruba, and Kwe is KW E. I had it written down. It's KWE. When you're looking, you're going to find it under Khoisan. Again, that word should not be used. It's not appropriate, but Kwe is the more appropriate word. But those are the two groups that don't have Neanderthal DNA. Everywhere else within Africa has 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. And that's because of the fact that the Levant and Arabian Peninsula were where we did the vast majority of our mixing. And so people going up and people going back, right? There is this constant movement. And that's the other thing. There is never any time when we're not constantly migrating, immigrating, moving. Never any time in human history, prehistory, because we're not talking history, we're talking prehistory. Never any time in prehistory where we're not constantly exploring. That's one of the things about us. We like to see new things. Ooh, new. You're fun. You're new. This new. That's new. That's new. What's over the horizon? That's really who we are, right? So as we're seeing people moving in, by 40,000 years ago, we're really getting to a point where they're the only group of humans still left in the area, because Neanderthals have not so much died out as become part of us, right? So at this point, you're looking at groups of people who probably, they've got very close Neanderthal ancestors, maybe within the last 3 generations, right? And 10,000 years, maybe, like by 30,000 years, you're not looking at that close, obviously, let's see, 100 generations is 2,500 years, right? So you're definitely looking at people who, have living memories, right, of who these people were at 50,000 years ago, at 45,000 years ago, right? And so when we are looking at the movement through and the settling in, what we're looking at is a group who, as they're moving in and settling in, are darkest skin and light, and they don't have the light eyes until they're getting settled. By 40,000 years ago, we're probably looking at lighter eyes, though I have not seen a lot of DNA that shows that has gone into really the eye color at that point of time. Really, it just goes into the genetics at that point of time. So I can't say for certain what alleles associated with eye color there are. So when we're looking at skin color and eye color, one thing that should be understood is everybody has melanin. I was going to say melatonin because my brain, but everybody has melanin. The condensing of your melanin or dispersal of your melanin designates whether or not you have darker skin or lighter skin. If it's got a higher condensation, it is tightly condensed, it is darker. And if it is loosely condensed, it is lighter. And the same thing happens with your eyes. Darker eyes just have much more melanin condensed within them, and lighter eyes just have more diffuse melanin within them. So the alleles for light skin and light eyes that we do get from Neanderthals does not necessarily give us the presence of light eyes or light skin. So we have alleles for light skin and light eyes that are for Homo sapien specific. They're genetically Homo sapien. And we have alleles for light skin and light eyes that are Neanderthal specific, right? And we have alleles for dark skin and dark eyes that are Neanderthal specific, and alleles for dark skin and dark eyes that are Homo sapien specific. You can have a combination of those two. Personally, I have the dark skin alleles for Neanderthal and some dark skin alleles for Homo sapien, and then more light skin alleles for Homo sapien, right? So you can have a combination of the two, and it might not express itself in the way that you might think it will, right? And the alleles for skin color and the way that we interact with skin color skin color has to do with evolution, but skin color also has to do with environment in which the mother is pregnant. And it has some to do with genetics, but not as much to do with genetics. There are famous cases where two white parents will have a black child. Sandra Lang from South Africa is one of those. There are cases where two light parent or two dark parents will have a light child without it being albinoism, right? There are different cases where we can see the fact that there is a genetic play in the alleles for skin tone, but there is also a play in like the environment that the mother is in when she is pregnant. If you are a lighter skinned individual and you are in an environment that is very sun heavy and you're outdoors a lot because it's not modern time, right? You might have a child who is a few shades darker than you. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to go from Northern European white to way down at the tip of Africa dark within a birth, right? But what it does mean is that you're going to be have children who are a little bit darker because they're adapting to their area so that they're actually able to subsist better in that area, right? That's cute, but not factual at all, EJ. Like there's like no facts in that sentence. I mean, I would invite you to look up, do white people have melanin? That would be the first thing that I would invite you to look up. Do white people have melanin? That simple Google search will absolutely show you that white people have melanin, that melanin is in everybody's skin, right? I'm indigenous, actually. But I would still, whether you decide what you think that I am culturally, right, or ethnically, whether you decide you know who I am culturally or ethnically, to debunk the entire sentence that you have, all I can tell you is go Google whether or not melanin is present in the skin of white people. So when we are getting at this point that we're settling in Europe as a darker skinned group of individuals and a darker eyed group of individuals. The likelihood is that we still also have tightly coiled hair. Tightly coiled hair is something that beautiful Black anthropologists actually did a lot of studying on. And came up with not came up with, but proved that tightly coiled hair has to do with protecting the skull and protecting the brain from sun, because it will create this shade and then this lattice work. And so air can move through that lattice work to cool the brain in a high sun environment. And this is why we have tightly coiled hair. So the likelihood is that we're still dealing, or not dealing with, but we still have these different adaptations that we have gotten from our time in Africa that the Levant didn't really change too much of, right? So when we're looking at our early statues, our Gravatian period, the belongings and the people, it is important to understand that the people that we are looking at are who we would phenotypically call Black. The things that they're taking from Africa and from the Levant area up into this region, and probably also you're seeing within the Neanderthals, are a lot of shell work, right? A lot of decoration of self that they are getting from that interaction with the Neanderthals in the Levant area. That decoration of self has a tendency to translate over. And so we see with the Gravatians that we are seeing people who are marking their bodies. Now, this marking of the body is going to start with, we have shells, ancient shells, like I think Neanderthal, the shell I'm thinking of, I believe, is Neanderthal, and it's like a half of just a regular clam shell. And you can see where somebody was mixing ochre in that shell. And so you're mixing ochre to paint walls or paint your body or paint your clothing, right? And in that mixing of ochre to paint your walls and paint your body and paint your clothing, so when we're seeing that, when we're seeing that, um, we're seeing this sense of identity that's coming across in bodily decoration. We see this translates into tattooing tools within the Gravatian culture. Our first actual evidence of tools for tattooing, and therefore the first evidences that we really have of tattooing as humanity, comes from the Gravatian culture. There is a cave in France that shows a single point flake that has blood residue and pigment residue on it. And this is our earliest tattooing tool. It's 35,000 years ago. We see with some of the Gravatian artwork, like the lion-headed anamorphic statue, that there looks to be tattoo marks on that statue. And as we're looking at different tattooing marks, we see that are different tattooing evidences within art and within statuing, we see that this kind of carries down in this period, similarly, uh, from this period down to the Europeans who come. So there are similar marks from the Gervasian period down. Um, we also see that it is within this time period that you're starting to see shell work sewn onto clothing, that you're starting to see usage of items as like decorative, right? Not only within our body decoration, but within like artwork on cave walls is absolutely decorative, but putting up like different things in your cave, right? We start to see, and not that caves are, really where we're living at this point of time. At this point of time, we're probably living in some combination of either, depending on if there is a local space that has a good cave to live in, that, or we do know now that like Heidelbergensis of 500,000 years ago built wood shelters. So it's quite possible we're also living in wood shelters. It's also quite possible that we are creating hide covered tents, hide covered spaces, right? So there are many different housing thought processes that can possibly come along this time period. We tend to think of people along this time period as having lived in caves because we're finding them in caves. We're not finding as much, I mean, we're finding evidence of fire in caves, but we're not finding evidence so much that all groups are living in caves. It does not mean that there are not evidences of some groups living in caves. There are evidences like the Nazova Cave, which is an extended period of usage over 100 and something thousand years, and it's a constant usage. So this is obviously people are in this cave on a regular basis, right? What it is that while we are doing that, there is also other methods of living that we're having at this point of time. We're also starting to see that at 40,000 years ago, we start to see tailored clothing. And what does tailored clothing mean? Tailored clothing means clothing that is modded to your body. There's not a whole lot of open area for wind to get through. So, tailored clothing comes about when you are able to start to kind of figure out how to cut clothing to fit the body somewhat, not like, what we think of tailored today. Um, and you can conceptualize binding those two pieces of those two sides of the leather together. So we actually have a hip bone of an animal that's 40,000 years old that has evidence of being poked with an awl in spacing that would be stitch spacing, like it's even spacing like this, and it's all poking. And so what you're going to do at this period of time is you're going to lay down your two pieces of leather on top of each other on a hard surface, and you're going to use an awl, usually made by bone at this point of time, because you're not going to get stone into as fine of a point to make an awl. So usually made by a bone tool, and you're going to use that bone awl and you're going to grind in the leather until you create a hole. And then you're going to also use that awl to kind of poke the whatever you're using to thread. So it could be sinew, it could be strips of other leather, but whatever you're using to bind, you're going to use that awl to kind of poke it through the hole so that you can pull your thread item through so that you can stitch your clothing together. So we're seeing our first evidences of tailored clothing roughly at this time. This evidences that we're seeing of tailored clothing and the evidences that we're seeing of decoration of self and decoration of body, all of this stuff really starts while we're still in the Levant area. Really starts when we're still in a space where we're really intermixing with Neanderthals, and we're really getting this concept that I am a me and you are a you. Not us versus them, but me. I come with individual traits that benefit individually. They benefit the community as a whole. Individualism is not helpful, right? It's not about benefiting me individually, but my individual talents, the things that I individually good at, are the things that benefit my community as a whole. And we get this idea that I have things that I'm good at, right? So I might be somebody who sews clothing. I might be somebody who flint knaps tools. I might be somebody who comes up with new ways to cook, right? I might be a basket weaver. I might have something that sings to me. I might be an artist, right? And so we have this sense of identity that has started in the Levant area and that intermixing with the Neanderthals that we carry down as we adapt our clothing usage, as we adapt into creating statuary, as we adapt into all the different tools that we later start to associate with us, right? This sense of identifying what I'm good at, this sense of identifying where I fit in the niche of the biome of our home and our community, right? What I bring to the table. And so there is a lot of thought process that the Gravachian Venuses have to do with an occupation. Could they be fertility occupation? Could they be midwifery occupation, right? And so our evidence of exactly how people are styling themselves is somewhat limited. A lion-headed statue with marks on its arm. The marks on its arm are going to be considered tattoo marks. The lion head could be an anamorphic thought process, as in you're imbuing the spirit of the lion within this, or it could be that somebody actually wears a hood of a lion or a head of a lion as a hood, and that's how they're, conceived by the rest of the group. Maybe this is, if the Venuses are evidence of a fertility position like midwifery, maybe this is evidence of a leadership position or a strength position or a hunting position, right? I don't know if I have any mods in here. It does not look like it. Yeah. Which means that you guys are all dealing with a lot of shit, and I apologize for that. Hold on just a second. I have to make some changes before I can do that, but let me go ahead and do that. YouTube, I have to move the camera really quick. Sorry. You can still see me, or seeing my hand and my phone in front. I apologize. I know that sometimes it can be really, really hard in here in my comments, and I didn't realize. If I add you as a moderator and you are not accepting that, please let me know and I'll go ahead and take it back out. I'm not trying to make anybody actually do stuff that they don't have to do, right? That's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, Maya, if you're still in here, that wasn't what I was trying to do. Okay. I went over what was disproven about the out of Africa theory. So, the fact that all sapien starts in Africa hasn't been disproven. The idea that we left early on is what's been disproven. Okay, as I stated, race has been debunked. What is black and what is white and all that sort of stuff, it's all been debunked. Phenotypically, they are what we would describe as black, and that is what I stated, that they were phenotypically what we would describe as black. And this is a combination of factors. This is the combination of a darker skin tone in a shade of dark that we would consider black, because different areas of the world have undertones and different areas of the world have differences to the skin that are different. Like somebody who is black within Australia is a different black than we see within Africa, right? There's undertones there. Somebody can be really dark along the equator in South America or Abiyala and not be phenotypically what we would describe as black, right? So what I'm saying is that we are looking at a group who is still phenotypically black, what we currently in modern day thought process would describe as black. And what I'm stating is this is pre-adaptation for area. right? Because it takes 100 generations for an adaptation to happen. That means 2,500 years for an adaptation to happen. Currently, at this time period, you might reach full adulthood, or the generational range might be 20 years, right? So maybe it's 2,000 years during this period. And when we're talking about an adaptation happening, what we're talking about is here. We're not talking here to here. We're talking in 100 generations, you might go from, let's take it the other way. You might go from North European white in 100 generations living in South Africa. You might go to what we might consider as Mediterranean. And then in another 100 generations, you might go to what you might consider as Arab, though that's Caucasian. And then in another 100 generations, you might go to what you would consider as South African Black at that point in time. So it's not going to be something where it's this to this in 100 generations. It's a timeline, right? It's a gradual change of your not thought process, of your skin tone, that it's an adaptation for an area, right? The miraculous thing about us is that we can adapt. The beneficial everywhere adaptation of skin tone is actually dark. That is the one that works everywhere. You can be dark of skin everywhere on this planet and subsist. You cannot be light of skin everywhere on this planet and subsist. So the advantage would be to have dark skin. The true amazing thing about it, though, is the ability to adapt depending on which part of the equator your people are on for an extended period of time, when you are constantly exposed to sun and you don't have the ability to adapt your surroundings to a point that you can not adapt, right? You have to adapt the body because you can't just adapt the surrounding. The lack of vitamin D is a problem, but the lack of vitamin D can be met with other needs. So studies have proven that we hunter-gatherers, which hunter-gathering and collecting are the same peoples. Hunter-gatherers move, collectors stay in one place, and they go out and collect and bring back. So the proven knowledge, or the new studies show that anybody prior to Western agricultural-based farming is, it doesn't matter what perceived gender you are or what biological sex you are, which there are 3 biological sexes. It doesn't matter what of the 3 biological sexes you are. It doesn't matter what perceived gender you are. Everybody is out hunting if they have the propensity to be able to hunt. Like if they're a good hunter, if they're not scaring off the animals, and if they can track, everybody's out hunting. And we've realized that we can see this because we can see that everybody that is hunting is using the rudiment of the stomach. So we still see this in cultures who are living in the Arctic. To get their vegetative needs met, what they do is they cut open the animal or the stomach of the herbivore that they just killed, and they'll eat the contents of the stomach. The herbivore, if you kill a walrus, the walrus can go down deep in the sea and they can get all this herb stuff on the bottom of the sea. And then when you kill the walrus and cut open its stomach, you're getting vegetative matter that you're not able to get from the Arctic tundra. I don't think walruses are in Arctic spaces, but you know what I mean. So when we're looking at hunting for your sustenance, you're gathering your vegetable content from the stomach of the animal just as much as you are anything else. So this gives us vitamin D in a level where we're not having to go out and search for, this plant gives us vitamin D and this plant gives us vitamin D. We're getting more vitamin D access to that way, or with that way. And there's also plenty of different plants that we've known of for generations that give us vitamin D. So the lack of vitamin D that we're getting from the sun because of darker skin in our first movements into these areas, and for a few thousand, well, tens of thousands of years in these areas, the lack of vitamin D that we're not getting from the sun, we're making up with what we're eating. And this is easy to do. It's a lot easier to do that than it is to make up for not being able to see the predator that's attacking you. You have to see the predator that's attacking you. You don't have to have vitamin D right then, right? So this is why we know not only that, but the fact that we have DNA that proves 10,000 years ago, well, he's no longer the first person in Britain. We have a 13,000-year-old skeleton in Britain and a 14,000-year-old skeleton in Britain. But the first for the longest period of time was Cheddarman. And Cheddarman was dark. The alleles are defined as sub-Saharan black. That is the alleles of Cheddar's skin. and his eyes are blue, bright blue, right? And this is because he didn't need to have his skin adapt as much as he needed his eyes to adapt. So we see that the eyes adapt before the skin adapts. So when we're looking at the Europeans who are living at 30 to 40,000 years ago, the Gervasian culture, we are looking at a group of Europeans who may be getting lighter, but they are still what we would define as Black. Okay. So the culture that we're looking at, the headdresses are things that we're not sure if we're looking at something that is braided into the hair or we're looking at a hat that is made. There is the Brassemphoe Venus looks like it's braids, and she's got long hair, and it looks like it's long braids, and it looks like it doesn't even look like she maybe even has shells. She might just have braids in her hair. And the Venus of Wollendorf, it's very hard to distinguish. She could have an extremely early version of wrapped braids around her head, or she could have shells. It almost looks like the pattern at the base of box braids, right? That does not mean that box braids were what she had, but the pattern of square across her head almost looks like the patterning that we see when we're doing box braids, right? There's that straight lined pattern, right? And so we see that within the Venus of Wollendorf's hair. So it could be, again, a shell cap, which is what this is depicting, or it could be braids, right? If they are braids, they're very, also, I mean, like, it, if it's just hair, it could also be some form of a bun work. Like it could also be like just tiny little buns all over the place. It's just squares across her head. You do see that there's a narrower strip here, and it comes down here. Like it would be like it comes down to her eyes. So if it's braids, it's a little weird that it comes down almost to her eyes, right? So that's one of the reasons they're like, well, this might be a shell cap. We do see shells associated with all of these sites, and we see shells that are punctured. And so the puncture means that they have been threaded, so they have been sewn onto clothing. Another thing we see is teeth. We see teeth of predators, and we see teeth of like elk teeth, like deer teeth, like mammal teeth that we would associate today with a lot of our decorations. And then we also see claws, talons, like even Neanderthals. There's finds of Neanderthals who have got eagle talons that they like worn as necklaces and stuff like that. And so we also see evidence of birds of prey talons being worn by these early Europeans by the Gervasian period, or during the Gervasian period. We see that during the Gervasian period, there is this influx of cold. And so this influx of cold, this little ice age is what we call it, drives people down further again, and then they come back up. And we see that in this influx of cold, that there are groups that come back up, and the Y DNA in that group has been replaced. So the group of Gervasians, because Gervasians are the Iberian Peninsula and pretty much all across the all around the Mediterranean, along the Western European side of the Eurasian continent. So from the edge of the Mediterranean over, and if you're looking at a map, like up to, see, I'm very geographically challenged, so telling you what countries are where is hard, but I think that's France, like up to the bottom edge of France. And so what we're seeing is that when this little ice age happens, the Gervasians, there are three distinct groups of Gervasians across this point genetically. They all share the same culture, but they have distinct mitochondrial DNA and distinct Y DNA. Again, we can see where a foundation population of somebody is by the mitochondrial DNA or by the Y DNA, right? And so when we're looking at them moving, they're living up in France, they're going up there like 50,000 years ago, where the Neanderthals are, and they're all up there. And then small ice age happens, and it pushes them down all along down the Mediterranean coast and into the Italian peninsula and into the Iberian Peninsula. And then at the end of that last ice age, you see that they're starting to move back up. When they're starting to move back up, the group that is near the Italian peninsula moves back up with a different Y line, a different genetic Y line. And it is thought that that different genetic Y line is actually coming from the Levant area moving over, or it's coming from the other gravation nearest to them, the other gravation group nearest to them. So there's a couple of different Y lines that they move back up with, right? Neanderthals are the ancestors of almost all of us across the entire planet. There are only 2 communities in the entire planet that do not have Neanderthal DNA. So when we're seeing that their gravations are moving back up and carrying their stuff back into the lower half of Western Eurasia with them, again, what we're seeing is shell and color for sense of identity, distinguishing factors like shell work, shell headwork, shell work on our beadwork as shells on the body, on the clothing. We're seeing evidence of mixing pigments like ochre. Charcoal is another pigment that we're seeing mixed. And there's a white chalky pigment that we get mixed that I cannot remember the actual name of. It's not chalk. It just brings its chalk in my mind. And we're seeing that you are using different like shells, different stone platforms and stuff to mix these pigments. And again, it is at 35,000 years ago that we see those first tattooing implements start to come into play. The 40,000-year-old anamorphic statue of the lion's head, that could absolutely be tattooing evidence on his arm. We don't know for certain, right? And so that could be our very earliest evidence of tattooing. In the book Ancient Ink that I have, that is a special focus on tattooing and the history of tattooing. They do believe that that is evidence of tattooing. So we can see evidence of tattooing with that as far back as 40,000 years among this culture. The tattooing that we see among this culture in its evidence seems to be straight line work. When we're looking at culture, all of these things define identity. All of these things are telling us who people are, right? And why they're telling us who they are is because people are creating things that define their identity to other people, right? So when we start decorating our clothes, we decorate our clothes so I can tell you who I am. I'll tell people often that I dye my hair a rainbow of colors. I did before I started going gray, and I love my gray. And so it's only recently I started doing colors again. But I'll dye my hair a multitude of colors so you can see across the room that I'm a rainbow of everything. And if you don't like it, you can run fast, right? So when we start decorating ourselves, we start decorating ourselves as this is who I am, so that you can see who I am. This is who I take pride in being. This is what I am, right? This is what I do. This is how I live. You know, today we look at it as our job. So you're not really having jobs at that point in time, but your skills, the things that you take joy in, the things that you take pride in, the things that sing to you. So the things that we're seeing that sing to people are working with tools. So tool making, flint work, basketry is there. We're seeing woodwork that creates wooden vessels. We're seeing clothing making. We're seeing art. And we're seeing a lot of art. All the statue making is all artwork. All of the cave walls are covered in artwork. We're seeing a lot of art. Putting shells on your clothing, this is art, right? This is fiber arts, right? So we're seeing a lot of art. And when we're looking at how to integrate these ancient connections into our own thought process of our own ancestors, and how to bring forward that indigenous thought process to who we are today, and how to find culture within these groups so that we're not appropriating other people's culture, or how to find understanding within these groups so that we can move forward singing to our ancestors in a better way. Things that we can take are we're seeing that we're looking at people who are able to cook things like flatbreads. We're looking at people who are eating a wide variety of the local, herbs and the local animals, right? I was trying for a different word there. We're seeing people who have medicine. So using your herbs and your medicine, this is definitely a connection to an ancestral group. We're seeing people who are using different natural elements to decorate their bodies. So when you're looking towards using a connective element, finding cowrie shells, finding teeth, finding feathers. These are all going to be decorative elements of self that you're going to find within these people, that you're going to find connects you to your ancestors. If you are in the United States, it is important to note that no birds of prey are to be owned by anybody or possessed by anybody who does not belong as an enrolled member in an indigenous nation. And I think you even have to have a permit. Like if you're going to have any bird of prey feather, you make sure that you have like the correct documentation, because it is illegal within the United States. So you can use other forms of feathers, right? You can use other forms of decoration with this. So a lot of shell work, a lot of feather work. Colors. The colors that you're looking at really at this point are going to be simple and basic. You're going to be looking at red, white, and black. These are the colors that you're going to see that are associated with, or that are easily accessible, right? We're not looking at a time period where we're really getting a lot of dyeing, right? And we're not really, because we really don't have a lot of yeah, I can't think of any evidence of dyeing clothing of any kind prior to Bronze and Iron Age that I can think of. Like I'm trying to think back through, and there probably is some out there, but I would state that it's not for a little bit longer, anyways, because we're also not finding like a lot of fibers within this. So I would state that you're probably looking at dyeing the clothing or dyeing different things as a later date, because I have not seen evidence that pushes it back this far. I've seen a lot of Bronze and Iron Age evidence, just nothing that pushes it back this far. And so you're looking at some very simple color schemes. The things that you can look at to try and identify, how to like say you're looking for artwork, or say you're looking for tattooing, or say you're looking for like design for, not design for clothing, but art for clothing, right? There's a lot of cave art during this period that you can look to. It's usually very stylistic with black outlines and red interior, and it is usually very animistic. So you're going to see that there are a lot of animal interactions within this. There's and I have the picture in my mind. There's a cave that's got like this fantastic like herd of bison moving across it, and so you're going to see stuff like that. When you're trying to adapt things without direct evidence, like tattooing in this time. So we know that there is the tattooing in this time, but we don't have direct evidence of what those tattoos are. What you can do is take the different things that you actually see in design wise with groups of people. So if you have cave art, take the design art for, or the design from the cave art, and then translate that to tattooing, right? So you can do, like, if you want to tattoo a connection to this, and you're looking at, a connection to, I think the cave that I'm thinking of is in Spain, so the Iberian Peninsula, right? You might take that large bison that is outlined as the head and the shoulders and the front legs and the horns as a black outline, and then kind of taper it off into your tattoo or into your body, because we see this happen even down the road when we see the Keserac tattoos, right? And you can taper that off and use that, and put a red kind of fill. And I would almost even like a smudge fill within it, right? And so there are ways that you can take the art that we see on walls, or that we see. I know that there's like some artwork, like there's one pendant that was found, but I want to say that's 27,000 years ago. It might still be Hervatian, but it's like a moon pattern, right? So you see a moon, and then you see like this star pattern around it, right? Something like that might be something that you could tattoo. So when you're looking at translating the artwork down, what you want to do is take the combined understanding. We know we have the tattooing. We know we have artwork. We know we have self-decoration of body. We know we're using these three primary colors. We know that we have this art, right? And you can combine those together to find your connection with it. Herbs is a usage that we're seeing as far back as the Neanderthals. Herbs go so far back. So when we're looking at things like spirituality, we can look at the herbs within the area to look at the spiritual connections for those. So we were talking last night about smoke cleansing. First, let me state that, well, all animistic cultures share a base value. That does not mean that all of their tools, all of their thought processes, all of their cultural elements are the same. So all animistic cultures share the base of animism, which believes that we are just another niche. We fit another niche in the biome. We're just another animal. We belong to a larger whole that is all intermixed and that everything has a life. The earth itself has a life. The animals have a life. The trees have a life. We have a life. Everything has an equal life and everything has an equal niche within the biome and everything fits together, right? So this is something that any culture that is animistic believes because that's what animism is. Really, every culture that we have in prehistory is an animistic culture until we get to the point where we start to get a thought process of deity and we start to get a thought process of hierarchy. So we're looking at animism as a global thought process at this time. So when we're looking at animism as the base, we can see that that connection is the base and that understanding is the base. We can't decide that because we have that connection that every single animistic culture likes to connect themselves to strong animals. Maybe some animistic cultures are connecting themselves to trees instead of animals, right? Meaning not every animistic culture is the people of the salmon. Some animistic cultures are the people of the trees, right? So you must understand that just because one animistic culture is connecting those dots does not mean every animistic culture is connecting those dots in that way. We do see, though, with the gravations that there are animal evidences, like the paintings of animals, this interaction, the animal-headed god or the animal-headed statue, right? We do see that there is this anamorphic exchange. So using that anamorphic exchange is something that you can do with the European ancestry with the gravations, right? If that is where you're taking it to, right? So it is absolutely going to be the animals that we're seeing a lot of and the most of are more herbivore animals, more animals that you're hunting than predator animals. So you're going to want to look towards animals that are hunting animals. Now, how do you know everything that's in that area at this time frame? Because, right? So if you're looking for the herbology in that area at the time frame, you can go and look at what indigenous herbs are. Say you're looking at the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula goes from the Eurasians to the Gravacians to the Solutreans. And during the Gravacian period, during the Elacian period, during the Solutrean period, what are the herbs in the area? You can look online and find what herbs are indigenous to the Iberian Peninsula. You can look and see, does that herb work with this? If you are wanting to do smoke cleansing, which is something that is pretty diversely seen among many animistic cultures and was, even seen in non-animistic cultures, smoke cleansing is one of those spiritual and herbal thought processes that goes back to that thought process of all connection. So if you want to use smoke cleansing, you might look at the herbs that are indigenous to the Iberian Peninsula and find what herbs are indigenous there. Rose is an herb that's usually indigenous across the globe, so I'll use rose. So if you're taking that rose and you're using rose for smoke cleansing, now you got to figure out what you're going to smoke cleanse in. Shells are a pretty global thing. Abalone is actually a pretty global thing. But if you want to really deliberately steer clear of anything that might smack to you of appropriating Native American heritage, you might decide you don't want to use that kind of shell. Now, if we're going back to the gravations, we're not looking at having glass and we're not looking at having iron. So what do you use if you're not using that shell in this time period? Now, you could use a different shell. Maybe you go and find one of those giant clam shells, right? Maybe you go and find a shell that's specific to the Mediterranean region, right? And you use that shell as what you're burning your rose in. Instead of that, maybe you go and find a good stone, right? A beautiful stone that you really like. And then when you find that beautiful stone that you really like, I mean, it could even be a small stone. It's not like you have to do a whole lot of burning, right? So you find a really good stone that you really like. This one's got all this pretty stuff in it. Maybe I use this stone and I put this stone down and I put my herbs on top of that stone and I get a coal from the fire. Or maybe I get the coal from the fire first and put the coal from the fire on the stone, which is a smarter way to do that. And then I pile the herbs on top and so it burns through those herbs, right? So this is a way that you can connect to that region, even if we don't have definitive thought process on a specific thing, right? So we don't have a definitive of what tattoos are being used. So you can use that thought process that they are utilizing the animals around them as a spiritual connection in their artwork. So it is likely that they're using that and an identifying connection as well. You can look at using herbology and take the knowledge that the use of herbology includes the uses, because smoke cleansing is actually physically helpful to the body. Like you can actually smoke cleanse the body and actually help the body, right? Hey, so you can use that knowledge in coexistence and find something within that specific region that you can utilize so that you are not appropriating a culture that is not your culture, right? So if you're looking at different regions within that space, you're going to get different answers, right? On the Iberian Peninsula, on the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula, you might find Atlantic shells instead of Mediterranean shells, right? If you're looking at the Italian Peninsula as the Gravachian culture that you believe that you go back to because you know your grandparents came from Italy, you can start looking at the shell work within or the shells within the Italian Peninsula. What and this is easy. What shells did Romans eat? What shells did people in this area eat? If you can find what they ate, you can find what shells they had, right? And so if I decide that I'm going to, look up the, that's not crustaceans. Crabs is crustaceans, right? Seafood, Italy Peninsula. Shell food. My brain is so out today. So it's traditional to find clams, mollusks, which are also clams, oysters. And so maybe you might find a really cool oyster shell and you use that, right? Um, Scallops don't really give a shell, though they do have like that outside thing. So maybe you find that and you use that, right? And that's just something that you're looking at with a really simple Google search. Now, if I know that they're using oysters, I might actually go and look online for oyster shells from that region, right? Like go and eBay, anybody got oysters or go and find an Italian company that ships worldwide or something like that, right? If I want to make sure that I'm getting the shell from that region, right? Um, Another thing that I can do in that is if I can't get a shell from that region, but I don't want to use a shell from the region that I'm in because I feel like that would be calling on the wrong ancestors, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean that's what it would be doing, but maybe that's the way you feel. I might be able to go and find a glass bowl that is shaped like a shell and use a glass bowl that is shaped like a shell, right? Um, yes, they don't have glass, but yes, they have this shell, and everything traditional was once brand new, right? So it is okay to kind of mix the modern in with the ancient, right? And absolutely, and lots of people use abalone, and abalone is indigenous to that region. But what I was stating was that if you don't want to use abalone because you feel that connects it too much to Turtle Island indigenous people's ceremony, and you want to use a different shell. Abalone is global, so using abalone is not going to be something that is close practice only to Turtle Island indigenous people because it is something that is global. Yet, if you're like, it feels like I'm using, then you might not want to. And that doesn't necessarily mean, that you should feel that way. I'm not saying that you should feel that way. I'm just saying if you need another option, here's the other options. The other thing is that along the thought process that everything traditional is once brand new, right? And along the thought process that we're adapting modern thought process into our ancient practices as well, you could also go and decide, okay, so I know that, well, the Gravachians might be using this thought process, that the Italians that are actually, because the Latin people, there's actually Latin tribes that are indigenous to the Latin Peninsula, right? So that the Latin people were using iron later on. So I might actually use the iron there, right? So we're specifically looking at the Gravachian period, which is between 4,000 and 40,000 and 30,000 BCE. So we are specifically looking at the Gravachian period in Europe. that is a group of people that were in Europe from 40,000 to 30,000. They are not the first, they are the descendants of the Eurasian population. I'm going with the Gravatians because by the time the Gravatian population rises, Neanderthal is gone from the region. They've been bred into and mixed into the Gravatians. And so their descendants are the Gravatians in this region. But by this point of time, Homo sapien is the only group in that region, and that is why we're going for the Gravatian period. So this is really like a disconnect, I think, for some people, and I'm not quite sure I understand why the disconnect happens. So just because a group of people is in a space and another group of people is in another space that came from the same space that this group of people is in does not mean that this group of people is descended from this group of people. So the first Homo sapiens to set foot anywhere across the globe looked like they had looked for the entirety of their time as a species. Outside of Africa, they had all lived in the Levant area for at least 100,000 years, which was still a part of Africa at the time. Yet it doesn't mean that they're descending from the people that are still in the Levant area now. If you have 3 bands of Homo sapiens that all live in the same area, and one band goes one place and another band goes another place, and the third band stays there, the 2 bands that left are not descendants of the band that stayed. Maybe that's the best way to get it through. When you have 3 bands of people in a singular area, right? 3 different genetically distinct groups of people in a singular area, and one group stays and 2 groups leave, the 2 groups that left are not descendants of the one group that stayed. They at one time lived in the same place, but they are not descendants of. And I'm not sure why this is continuously disconnecting from people or for people. Like there seems to be, whether it's the ethnocentric thought process or whether it's the your Native Americans are from Asia thought process, there seems to be this disconnect. Me and my next door neighbor and my upstairs neighbor go to 3 different places. We all lived in this apartment at the same time frame, but we go to 3 different places after we live in this apartment. It doesn't mean we're descended from each other. It doesn't even mean we're related to each other. It just means we lived in the same space at the same time. Right? Because there is this disconnect, and this disconnect is often used to erase people. This disconnect is also often used to harm people, and that's why I'm really like, this disconnect is interesting to me. Like I think sometimes it's purposeful so that you can create harm, yet sometimes I think it's not purposeful. Sometimes I think it's just a lack of understanding, right? When 3 distinct groups of people live in the same space, that does not mean that they're related. And if 2 leave and 1 stay, it does not mean that the 2 that left are descended from the one that stayed. They all lived in the same place. They are not all the same people. The people outside of Africa currently today are descended from groups who moved outside of Africa. They're not descended from the groups that stayed in Africa. That's a distinct line. Those who stayed in Africa are genetically distinct. Those in the Levant area are genetically distinct. Those in the Arabian Peninsula area are genetically distinct. Those in Siberia are genetically distinct. Those in Asia are genetically distinct. Those in Australia are genetically distinct. Those in Abiyala are genetically distinct. Those in North America or Turtle Island are genetically distinct. And many groups within those places are genetically distinct from each other. Now, that does not mean that we don't share genomes back and forth, because there's only 25,000 genomes for a human, right? And we all have a whole bunch of them. So, yes, we have some of the same genetic markers as humans, but our DNA lines don't match up. You're not descended from, it just doesn't work like that, right? It just doesn't work like that. Now, we all share a common ancestor to a point. And so we all share a common ancestor species. We all don't all share the same grandmother. Adam and Eve didn't happen. And the grandfather species and the parent species of Homo sapien are like 5 different species. We have multiple parent species. We come through a speciation through convergence. So because of that, Homo sapiens who developed in Morocco had distinct genetic ancestors, or distinct different grandparents than Homo sapiens who developed in Ethiopia at the same time frame. They have distinct different parents. And the Moroccan Homo sapiens parents and the Ethiopian Homo sapiens parents are not from the same family line. Okay. Adam and Eve is not the reality. We don't all come from 2 people. We come from probably a starting base of several 100,000 in many different spaces. Adam and Eve doesn't exist. We do not all descend from 2 people. Well, we all have the same we are all one species, and we all have the same space origin, right? And we have genetic similarities. We do not all descend from a singular population. We do not all come from a singular population. We come from multiple populations and convergence. So saying that people in Europe are descendant from people in Africa is incorrect. People in Europe are descendant from people in Europe. Saying that we all started in Africa is correct, but the people who moved outside of Africa and the people who stayed in Africa are physically impossible to be the same person. It is physically impossible for the same person to have left Africa and stayed in Africa. Physically impossible. Right? Now, that does not mean, of course, that we're not all the same human. We're all one race, right? What it means is that those who are currently outside of Africa are not descended from those who are currently inside of Africa. They are descended from people who were outside of Africa, or who left. They're descended from people who left Africa. They didn't leave behind their genome in Africa, right? Now I just don't know where the disconnect gets, and I don't know how to explain it any differently. I'm just trying here. So when we're looking at the Gravachian population, we're looking at a population that, for the most part, had spent 100,000 years in the Levant area before they moved into Eurasia. And then they were in Eurasia for 50,000 years before we get to the Gravachian period. The people in the Levant area are going up into Europe and back into Africa. That still doesn't mean that, okay, so if I'm in the Levant and I have 3 children in the Levant and they're mixed with Neanderthal. And one of them goes into Africa, and one of them goes into Asia, and one of them goes into Europe. The one in Asia and the one in Europe are no more descended from the one in Africa as the one in Africa is descended from Asia or Europe. Right? You do realize that theory has been tested and is fact, right? Hypothesis is the word you're looking for. Theory is something that has been tested and is fact. It changes because change happens, and theory in all of science are things that constantly retest, and theory is only based on something that has been tested and the tests can be replicated. That's what a theory is. And so theory is something that is based on current fact, current evidence. Evidence changes. Yes, but if an African goes out of Africa, their grandchild is not descended from their niece. Or a totally different if a person in Kenya leaves Africa and moves to the US, their grandchild is not descended from a person in Ethiopia. There are 3 ghost species within African DNA in 2 populations in Africa, 2 communities in Africa. The Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa are the only 2 populations on the planet that don't have Neanderthal DNA, because everywhere else does pre-colonization. And those 2 populations have 3 ghost species in their DNA. That's the ghost species DNA that we see within African populations. So when we are looking at the Gravatian people, again, when you're looking at this as an ancestral connection point, what you want to do is look at the knowledge that we have, which again is very little, right? So if your grandparents leave Africa, Kenya, right? You are descendant from the grandparent that is in Kenya, yes. But what you're not descended from is an entirely different population, say in Ethiopia. If you look at the origin of our species, and instead of seeing one group of people all together, you see that that's not how it was, because that's not how it was. It was not one band of Homo sapiens all living together, right? Like all the original Homo sapiens aren't all in the same space. We now know that the origin of Homo sapien happens in like 3 different spaces in Africa, that there's a convergence to become a full species, but that convergence doesn't mean that we all become together in one group. So if you have a community of 100 and another community of 100 and another community of 100, and they don't descend from each other and they're not interrelated. Okay, so I want you to start there. We're not talking about the community you descend from. We're talking about a community you don't descend from. That's what I want you to start with. So if you have 3 different communities that are not interrelated, right? And one community stays in the space that you're at, and 2 communities leave the space. The 2 communities that leave the space are from that space, but they've left nobody behind in that space. So there's nobody in that space to create children for you to be connected to. So you're not descendant of the community that's already there, that's still there and remains, because you have no genetic connection to the community that's still there and remains, because you never had any genetic connection with them in the first place. And if you're not leaving behind the community or leaving behind the ends of that community, then there's not even bones in that space that you're leaving behind, right? And so that's what that difference is. When we are looking at having come from a space, it doesn't mean that we are descended from people in that space. Just because so we know now that we don't solidify as a singular species until 125 to 135,000 years ago. As I was stating earlier, we were in the Levant area by 150,000 years ago, mixing with Neanderthal by 150,000 years ago. So before we become a singular species, we're already outside of Africa and mixing with other people, or outside of what we consider Africa today at this point. It is still attached to the continent of Africa, right? We're already outside of what we consider Africa today and mixing with another group by the time we become a singular species. And even as a singular species, that doesn't mean that we're all one community living together. And it doesn't mean that the separate communities are all descendant from each other, because we didn't even start as one community. We now know that our speciation comes from a community in Morocco, has several different species in that community, Heidelbergensis, Ancestor, Ergaster, and the convergence of those species creates a Homo here and a Homo here, a sapien here and a sapien here, right? Maybe an Ancestor and a Heidelbergensis create a sapien, and maybe an Ergaster and a Erectus create a sapien. And over here in Ethiopia, maybe a Heidelbergensis and an Ancestor, and maybe an Ergaster and a Heidelbergensis, and they both create a sapien. And down here in South Africa, we see that maybe an Ergaster and an Ancestor, and maybe a Heidelbergensis and an Erectus, and they create sapiens. None of these sapiens are even coming from the same prior species. So now over the next 100,000 years, there are many bands of many different species, and they start to create small pockets of groups of Homo sapiens that aren't even related. Okay. And then all of those groups end up forming a solidified species, not that they meet, not that they live together, not that they all are in the same space at the same time, but our view of the skull structure and the DNA becomes a singular species. Okay. Now, before that singular species happens, part of us are already moving out, coming back, moving out, coming back, moving out, coming back, moving out, right? So if group A, group B, and group C have no genetic relation to each other, and they're all in Ethiopia, group A, group B, and group C have no genetic relation to each other, they're all in Ethiopia. Group B and Group C leave Ethiopia. They're not leaving any genetic relationship behind in Ethiopia. That's just where they were. That's where they grew. That's where they were born. That's how they, where they came to be, right? But they're taking their entire genetic group with them as they're leaving, which means that they're not leaving their ancestors behind. They're leaving other species behind that are their ancestors, right? But they are moving out as a whole genetic group. So the group that's remaining in Ethiopia is not the grandparents of the group that left Ethiopia. They're not even the cousins of the group that left Ethiopia. They're their own group, right? So as you see people moving across Eastern Eurasia and coming to Australia and to the Turtle Islands, the group that is moving across Eastern Eurasia first that goes into Australia, they're a whole group that moves across. They don't even leave people behind. They don't leave behind their genetic descendants. So their genetic descendants aren't in Asia to be related to the people in Australia. And the same thing is happening with the Turtle Island Indigenous. They're not leaving behind their siblings or their mother. They're taking their group with them and moving, Okay. And then they're moving out from there, right? So it's not that you have a group and they're dividing into two. And so grandparents are, it's not the Civil War. It's not the North versus South. It's not brother versus brother. It's not splitting up a group of family. It's genetically distinct groups moving in genetically distinct packs across. Okay. So the idea that everybody outside of Africa is descended of the population that's still in Africa is false. It's not that. It's genetically distinct groups. It's not intermixed as much as you want to think of it as. And it's not Adam and Eve. It's not a singular population we all come from. We do not all come from a singular population. And the only reason that this is so, I don't understand where the disconnect is with it. And it is something that is being used to harm people. So I'm going to ask you to maybe dig a little bit more and maybe look kind of better into it before you start erasing people based on your perception of it, because it's causing problems, right? Oh, we don't get monarchs until later. Monarchs are way, way, way later. And we've always moved. We're always constantly moving. That's a huge thing. We're always constantly going from space to space to space to space to space. Okay. That's a good way, kind of a way to put it. They were from the continent of Africa, but they are not current Africans. Yeah, and that's what it is. Savage technique. It's so much the fact that we are definitely looking at this ethnocentrism that is trying to erase different groups, and I'm not okay with that. Please stop. Not only that, I mean, it harms, like, the most harmed people in this group are Afro-Indigenous people. Like, because Afro-Indigenous people are being attacked from all sides because people are like, well, you're not Indigenous, you're Black. And people are like, well, we're all Indigenous, like, and there's this constant attack. I have so many Afro-Indigenous siblings who are sitting here going, oh my God, stop attacking me. That's not what you think, you know? Um, and the erasure of an entire group of people is just really problematic. The erasure of an entire group of people, and again, the giving of excuse to deny accountability of the white superiority complex, right? The giving of excuse to deny accountability for Europeans, to erase the slave trade, to make it as if the slave trade did not happen, and to erase accountability for Europeans, as well as erase an entire culture. That's problematic. This is a Gervasian person. The Gervasian, hi T. The Gervasian people are people who are, there are people, that's why chill. The Gervasian people are some of our first people in Eurasia, in Western Eurasia, in Europe. There are, the Eurasian people are living with the Neanderthals. I'm looking at the Gervasian people now as I'm talking about the Gervasian people as the first people that are living in Eurasia without the presence of the Neanderthals in the culture. That's totally cool. I don't care how you identify. I care if you're erasing another culture in your identity, but I don't care how you self-identify. Everybody has the right to self-identify. Right? I'm really big on the fact that it's not appropriate to erase other cultures, especially if they're asking you not to. I'm indigenous, but I'm not going to tell you that I'm Dene because I'm not Dene, right? And somebody from Dene, if I was sitting here going, I'm Dene, would be able to tell you they're not Dene, right? And they have the right to say, I don't belong to their culture because I don't belong to their culture and it's theirs. People don't have the right to tell you don't belong to a culture unless it's their culture, right? Yet, and you get to self-identify. You get to self-identify. You cannot identify as a culture that is currently here, that is currently fighting to receive recognition on identity anyways, because that culture doesn't identify you as belong, unless, that's the best way to put it, unless that culture identifies you as belonging to that culture, right? If there is an existing culture, you cannot claim belonging to it if you do not belong to it because you don't belong to it, right? Yet you can self-identify as anything that you want, right? Cro-Magnon is literally just one skull of a modern human. Cro-Magnon is like 30,000 years old, and Cro-Magnon is the name of a skull. It's just the name of an autonomic. No, it's not gonna work. It's not gonna work. My words are not gonna work. It's the name of a modern human, a skull of a modern human, just like we have uh, we name our skulls usually. So Skelly is the girl that had her foot amputated at 31,000 years ago in Borneo, right? Denny is the half Denisovan, half Neanderthal girl. Uh, Cro-Magnon is the name of a skull. People have it confused, but Cro-Magnon, and the thing is when it was found, it was our earliest example of us, and that's why it was named as early us. But it's literally 30,000 years old, and if you look at it, those guys, they're like Irish that are kind of short and their face are a little condensed, but they got like that really round head and that really flat face. The skull looks like that. Like I look at the skull and I think like a little Irish leprechaun when I look at the skull for Cro-Magnon, right? And it is literally just the name of a skull. Yeah. Well, no, because Ed Sheeran has more of a round face. This is kind of a little square. The leprechaun from what is the one? The toucan, not toucan, the marshmallows, Lucky Charms, the leprechaun. It looks like the face from the leprechaun. Just makes me think of a redhead. Just teeny little. Yes, the man behind me is Homo sapien. He's a Gravasian, Homo sapien sapien. Um, the divide line between Homo sapien and Homo sapien sapien, I think it shifts and it changes. Like they say that we get to the brain development we're at like 30, 40,000 years ago. But if you look at older skulls, you'll see that older skulls are shaped the same way. Older skulls are larger in size than ours. So like older Homo sapien skulls have more cubic centimeter capacity than ours does. They're bigger brained, but the shape is the same. Um, I kind of think that kind of divide comes when we start burying our dead and having identity, which starts at roughly 100,000 years ago for us. So I would think for us personally, as my personal opinion, the difference between Homo sapien and Homo sapien sapien would be about 100,000 years ago. Some people put that difference at about 50,000 years ago. It shifts, right? And it does actually shift a little bit. Autonomically. I'm still going to do autonomous. Yeah, it's not. It's just an early modern human. It's just, well, it's not even early modern human. Actually, it's Homo sapien sapien. Cro-Magnon is actually Homo sapien sapien. It's 30,000 years ago, and the shape and everything else is Homo sapien sapien. My partner woke up as I was talking, so I'm going to get up and go spend some time with my partner. Before I do, I'm going to go over what I do at the end of every single one of my lives. We did not go so much today in how biologically we can prove that we're nurturing and communal. This has to do with the fact that we have mandatory midwifery, and this has to do with the fact that we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult, unlike any other species on this planet, which means that we have to nurture our young to adulthood, right? It takes roughly 30 people in a band to nurture a child from neonate to adult. So when we're looking at this, what this means is that biologically, this European human being behind me would be the ancestors of the Europeans in the area today. The light color of skin doesn't come about until about 5,000 years ago when it starts to become a significant portion of the population. At roughly uh, 4,000 years ago, you might see that we're looking at over 50% of the population. At roughly 2,000 years ago, we're starting to look at in Northwest European population only. We're starting to see that white skin, light skin, or uber light skin becomes roughly 80% of the population. At 10,000 years ago, even in the sagas, there are famous Vikings in the sagas who are darkest skin. Egil is darkest skin. So at 10,000 years ago, you're still seeing roughly 10% of the population of Scandinavia is dark of skin. So that's how light comes into play. And how it comes into play is light. It comes into play by being in a low sun environment in an extremely northern climate. It also, there's some ideas that it helps with heat retention. And so between those two things, that's why light skin comes about in these environments. So biologically or we are nurturing and communal as a species. And because we are biologically nurturing and communal as a species, we live in a time frame where we're being told that that's wrong and that's bad and that's evil. We don't have community and we don't nurture our children very much. And because of this, most of us are dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety. Most of us are having a huge issue with mental health. And the reason that we're having a huge issue with mental health is because of the fact that we are having a healthy reaction to an unhealthy society. Our society is ill, our society is sick. And so, if you are dealing with the mental health issues that come about from having a healthy reaction to an unhealthy society, you're not the problem. One of those mental health issues is that thought process that you're the problem, and you are not. Actually being awake, actually seeing what's going on, actually seeing that this is, I don't hate my skin tone. That's cute, Stephanie. Listen, your white supremacist bullshit can take a ride. You're worried that you're not the supreme being. Honey, you never were. So, belonging to a society where everybody treats each other like shit and there's no nurture and community left means that those who are healthy are having healthy responses to an unhealthy society. So if you're dealing with a lot of depression, you're dealing with a lot of anxiety, you're hurting at this time frame, I want you to understand that you're actually a necessary person in this time frame. You are part of the solution to the problem. Okay. You can't fix things if you don't know they're broken. You can't change things if you don't see that they need to be changed. And when you can look at this and see that we're all hurting, that it's not okay for children to be carpet bombed, when you can see that war in the name of a God is not okay, and that hoarding resources and making everybody else starve to death is not okay. When you can see those things, then you can affect the change that is necessary to happen. You are not the problem, you are part of the solution. If you don't have the compassion and empathy and the ability to actually be nice to each other that some people have displayed today, then you might need to see a counselor because you might actually have some serious mental health issues with a lack of compassion and empathy. That's still not making you any less worthy of the life that you have. We are all worthy because we are all breathing. You don't have to be anything else but breathing to be worthy of life. Okay. But to be alive, to be worthy of having that life. Now, that doesn't mean that some people don't add more worth. Those who are taking care of community add more worth, right? Yet you have worth just by being here. You have worth to our species as a whole. You have worth to the continuation of our species just by being alive. Please give yourself grace and give yourself love. You would give grace and love to anybody else on this planet, give it to yourself. And remember that you have worth just by breathing, just by living. Okay? I don't think anybody should be ashamed of their skin tone. I believe I very obviously got white ancestors, right? I'm very multicultural and I come from every part of this planet. I have ancestors that came over on the slave trade. I have ancestors who were already here. I have ancestors in indigenous groups across the planet that are still there. I have ancestors from the Middle East to Ireland to Asia. I have ancestors to Australia. I have ancestors everywhere, right? I don't like what some of my European ancestors did to some of my other European ancestors. Not only to some of my other European ancestors, but obviously to my Trililan indigenous ancestors and my Abiyalian indigenous ancestors and my African ancestors. I don't like what some of my European ancestors did, right? That does not mean that I'm ashamed of my skin. That means that I look at what they did as wrong and I'm trying to make change that affects positively the descendants of the other groups that they harmed and myself, right? That I'm trying to if I look at grandpa and grandpa has a really bad view of life, but grandma has a really positive view of life, I'm uplifting grandma's positive view and I'm eradicating grandpa's negative view, right? So I'm not ashamed of my skin color. I'm not ashamed to be white. I'm not white, but I'm not ashamed to have white skin. And I'm not ashamed of my European ancestry. White is kind of a cultural thing, especially here in the US. It's more than your skin tone, it's about who you are. and I was raised indigenous, right? So I'm not ashamed of my skin tone, and I don't think anybody should be ashamed of their skin tone. I think the idea that people should be ashamed of their skin tone is what we're all trying to get rid of, because there's a lot of people who have been taught to be ashamed of their skin tone that have some very beautiful skin tones, right? And they should have never been ashamed of their skin tone in the first place. Shame over your skin tone is something we're trying to eradicate and get rid of, right? What we're trying to do is, make a better world where it doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your genetics says. You're worthy, right? So, with that, if you have ancestry on both sides, or even if all of your ancestors are European and you're like, shit, I'm all European and man, they were fucked up. There are many of your European ancestors who were colonized. Half of your European ancestors, I will guarantee you, were colonized. Half of your European, there are people in Europe currently today in areas that you probably came from who are still fighting for indigenous recognition, and you probably actually have genetic connection to them. Okay. So, what you can do, even if you're all European, instead of being ashamed, instead of feeling like you're supposed to be ashamed, is to connect to your European ancestry and the indigenous groups within your European ancestry, and to try and help other indigenous groups in their movement forward to have sovereignty, to have land back, to have the right of recognition of worth that isn't based on skin tone, right? You take care of others and you uplift others. I'm not. I'm responding to somebody who asked because they might be. And I want to make sure that people understand that it's not about being ashamed of it's not about being ashamed of your skin tone. You should never be ashamed of your skin tone. You can hate what your ancestors did, absolutely, right? But that doesn't mean that's you. You might carry some of that epigenetics. And if you're working to uplift what they did, then absolutely it means it's you, and maybe you should be ashamed of that. But as long as you're working to uplift other humans, as long as you're working for the betterment of the planet for other people and not trying to uplift white supremacy, being ashamed of your skin tone would be ridiculous, right? And it happens, Willow. It does happen, right? So we see that there are indigenous populations across Europe. Celts are indigenous populations. The Sami are an indigenous population, right? There are many indigenous populations in Eurasia, right? The Ainu look more white than the Japanese population they live among, and they're the indigenous population of Japan, right? So don't be afraid or ashamed of your skin tone. And while you can hate what some of your ancestors did, being ashamed of it doesn't help anybody. Helping change it is what you want to do, right? And as long as you are working towards change and working towards helping other people and working towards the benefit of everybody, right? Working towards uplifting those voices that were marginalized, there's no reason for you to feel guilt, right? That's that white guilt that everybody talks about. That's not a positive thing, right? And from that white guilt that everybody talks about, that's not a positive thing, comes that white savior context, where that white guilt makes me feel like I have to change everything. And so I know how it needs to be changed, right? So instead of having that white guilt, instead of being ashamed, what you do is you use the compassion and empathy, because you mentioned those in your comment, and that's real. You use the compassion and empathy that you have to ensure that marginalized voices are not silenced, to build people back up, to help decolonization. We talk in here a lot about the fact that if you're trying to decolonize as somebody who is a European only descendant, really it's only your mind that you can decolonize here within the United States. What you can do is help the nations that are here that are trying to achieve land back or achieve sovereignty to decolonize. And that involves going into a space with the skills that you have. I have carpentry skills and I have oration skills. What can I do to help? I want to ensure that you get what you need, that you get land back, that your sovereignty is respected, and that you are taken care of. So what can I do to help decolonize this space for you, right? And this gives you a list of skills that you have, so they're not trying to think off the top of their head and you're making them do more labor. And it's not that white savior complex that goes in thinking it knows what needs to be done, because that's what that white savior complex is, right? So I am saying land back globally. And that is, for me, that's the answer of everything that I talk about in here. And we didn't really talk about the rise of violence and how all of this stems from hierarchical civilizations from the Middle East today. But in everything, for me, the way to get us to a point where we are no longer killing our species, because we are causing climate destruction with Western based agriculture and Western based capitalistic greed. We are causing the destruction of our species and the mass extinction of our species. And for me, land back is the answer, because land back is the returning of tending and governance to indigenous cultures around the world. Land back means that people will have the ability to tell you what the land that they belong to needs, right? To actually take care of the land that they belong to, because people belong to a land, not land belong to people. It doesn't mean kicking people out. It doesn't mean go back where you came from. That's a European concept that is rooted in their patriotism and their white supremacy and their racism. It's not go back where you came from. Nobody's kicking anybody out. It's giving tending and governance to the indigenous people that have the belonging to that space. And that is decolonization, because colonization is when a foreign people or a group of people comes in and replaces the current culture and the current government with their own culture and their own government, often through methods of violence. That is colonization. So removing the foreign government and uplifting the government and culture that was there already is decolonization. It's removing the colonized government. So land back is removing the colonized government and replacing that government with the governance of the indigenous nations that were here, that had beautiful governmental structures, who saw that everybody was fed and taken care of, as opposed to the European government structures that induce starving for hoarding so that they can make a dearth so that you can give them money, right? So that is what land back is. And returning tending of the land to indigenous cultures across the globe ensures people across the globe are fed. Today, we're not feeding people across the globe because we're intentionally starving people. So returning tending ensures that people across the globe are fed, and it also ensures that the land returns to what it's supposed to be, so that this atmospheric changes, the climate destruction that we are causing. Climate change happens. We were talking about climate change when we were talking about glacial maximums. That's climate change. Climate change happens. Climate destruction is an entirely different thing. And climate destruction that is happening currently is going to mass extinct our species. We know this. This is a fact. And if you're blind to that fact, it's because you're intentionally blind to that fact. We are facing mass extinction because of the way we behave. And if we return the way we interact with the environment to the indigenous thought process, which we know of today as permaculture, which is actually indigenous agriculture, then we can actually save our planet, our sustainability on this planet, right? Because the planet's not going anywhere. And this is something that has been scientifically proven. That's what permaculture is. And we're all talking about how if we could use permaculture, maybe we would be better. Permaculture is indigenous agriculture. So if you are somebody who is feeling the depression and the anxiety that comes as a natural response to this extremely sick society, I want you to remember that you are worthy and you are necessary for the change that we need to move ourselves forward as a species, so that we will be here in another 1,000 years, so that we will not mass extinct ourselves, so that you have grandchildren that can breathe. And so not only are you not the problem, you are the necessity for the change. Give yourself grace and give yourself love, because you are necessary. And I know most of the time you don't feel like it, but you absolutely are. And give yourself grace and give yourself love, because you are worthy of both. Whether you think you are or not, you are worthy of grace and worthy of love just by existing. And read more on landback.org. Absolutely. Much love, everybody. I will see you guys all probably after the weekend is over, though my father is in town for the next week, so I'm not sure exactly how much, but I will be back. I updated the website today, so everything should be a little bit easier to find on the website, including all the things that we talked about today. And I am also working on getting a few videos out that are actually the ones that I've been working on doing for a hot minute, and so they might have a little bit more of this and a little bit more information. Take care, everybody. I don't regularly stream because my ADD and my mental health doesn't allow me. I'm an agoraphobic at this point. I'm just now starting to leave my house. I don't regularly do anything. If I have things that I'm supposed to do, I tend to not do them because my brain. So I don't come here regularly. I am on YouTube as well, and YouTube will announce when I'm streaming. So if you're not getting announcements of my streaming, if you follow me on YouTube, I stream in both places at the same time. I start the streams at the same time, so you can actually follow me on YouTube, and it'll announce when I'm streaming, so you can pull it up here in TikTok if you'd like to. And you can also find these lives on YouTube if you're missing any of them. They are absolutely on YouTube. And so you can see them over there and you can get the information that you may have missed. My words today. Have a great day, everybody. Much love. Take care. Let me do it.